Hi everyone, welcome to our Behavior Change Study Replication Project for SPCE 611 at Ball State University. For this project, 5 students from BSU replicated a study on the effects of video self-evaluation and the acquisition of yoga postures.
Hi, I'm Michelle Brooks, and I'm going to be discussing the original study that we decided to replicate, which was the effects of video self-evaluation on skill acquisition with yoga postures. The purpose of this study was to evaluate whether or not self-evaluation and direct video feedback is or was effective. And does this form of instruction increase accuracy with yoga poses? The participants for this study were 2 participants, Bill, age 21, who had a little bit of experience with yoga and fitness, and then Ted, who was interested in yoga, but he didn't have much experience. And their way they got their participants for this study was by responding to a flyer. The setting for the original study was in a fitness lab, and the materials that they used were camera tripod, a video camera, a laptop, iTunes, a yoga mat, and a memory card to record the yoga postures. So for the original study, there was a few phases. The first phase was obviously baseline. In the baseline study, the participants, they were given verbal instruction and model for the first 2 sessions. For the remainder of baseline, the participant was instructed by the researcher to just continue following the methods that were discussed in the first 2 sessions and modeled. Once participants began the intervention phase, each participant was asked to perform each pose, which was 3 different poses, 2 to 3 times daily and record themselves. The participants then watched the video while taking data on themselves, using a task analysis that was given to them and that had been used in the baseline. This intervention was applied to 1 pose at a time. So after the intervention was done with the first pose, they would go to the second pose and then the third pose. For the intervention phase, treatment integrity was gained by having the researcher watch the participants. For Bill, it was 50% of sessions, and then for Ted, it was 40%. So they would watch the participants' videos and then also check their data. In this intervention phase, there was also IOA data recorded, and this was done by 2 blind participants who took 33% of the data for each participant. And then the IOA was just the agreements divided by the agreements plus disagreements times 100%. If treatment integrity fell below 80%, they had to go into what they called a retraining session. And so the retraining session was when the participant and the researcher got together and they watched their video, and then the researcher would give them, pointers and another model, and then they would go over the data together. And so that's only if the treatment integrity fell below 80%. Following the intervention phase, there was a maintenance phase. And then the maintenance phase was after a certain amount of time, they retrained after there was the removal of the intervention for the participants. And then they recorded data on themselves using the task analysis. So the results for the for this study did show that video self-evaluation had an immediate increase in the percent of correct poses across the participants, and also that the video feedback procedures resulted in substantial increase, not just a little bit, but a pretty substantial right away. There was also some skill acquisition in the baseline phase that was shown if the baseline was longer for a pose for a participant, there was marked improvement in the baseline alone. So for Bill, it was effective across all three poses. For the tree pose in baseline, the mean was 17%, and then in the treatment phase, it went all the way to 96% mean. For downward dog, his mean was 37%. And then it went to 73% in the intervention phase. And then for warrior pose, the mean for the baseline, which was a long baseline, was 48%. But again, it was a longer baseline for Bill during the warrior pose. And then there was a mean of 87% in the intervention phase. For Ted, for downward dog, it was 13%. And then in the intervention phase, it went to 48%. For tree pose, it began at 29%, and then in the intervention phase, 98%. And then for the warrior pose, there was a baseline mean of 55, and then it increased in the intervention phase to 86%. And an interesting thing that I noticed and the group touched on is that when we looked at the baseline phase and then the intervention phase and last the maintenance phase, maintenance across all subjects and across all poses did show a decrease, substantial decrease in the maintenance once the treatment was removed, which might indicate that this treatment, although effective initially, doesn't have long-term effects on fluency and maintenance phase. For example, Bill, who had 96% in intervention, when he retrained and when he did his data for the maintenance, it went down to 57%, which is pretty substantial because the time between intervention and maintenance was not that long. So you would think that it would have, he would have had sustained or retained the correct poses. Another example was, was a downward dog. For Bill, in his maintenance, it went from 73% to 53%. So that was quite a change in the maintenance phase. So next, I'm going to talk about the literary review that we did following the original study. So in the original study, after reviewing this, we wanted to see, why are we even going to look at this, right? So what's the social validity of this study as a whole, and how it's going to be applied to our lives as future participants of a replicated study. And essentially, yoga is increasing in popularity, and we found that there has been a lot of injuries related to incorrect poses. And because it's so popular, these class sizes are larger, and there's not as many instructors to give feedback. And that was shown in an article also that we found. And then, next, why video self-evaluation? So why did this study use that as their intervention? And so we found a few articles that did discuss how effective video self-evaluation is, not only for correct yoga poses, but also, for example, increasing safety in hospitals for nurses, and then also increasing appropriate peer interactions with children with emotional disabilities. They were able to watch this video model, and then by watching the video model, implement what they saw in a video model in a social skills setting. So that was pretty interesting to see different uses of video self-evaluation and video modeling. And then so why are these procedures used, and why to increase target behaviors? And so, essentially there's a lot of advantages of this type of self-monitoring, and that includes generalization, which is really, really important. Without generalization, there's really, no point in in learning anything, right? Because if you can't generalize to your environment, then, why are we focusing on it? So that was an advantage of using self-monitoring. And then also video modeling. It's an important recommendation to gain stimulus control. And that was touched on from an article actually in this class. So thank you for that. And then, next we're going to talk about the purpose of the study.
So the purpose of our study was to use video self-evaluation to increase the accuracy of 3 beginner level yoga poses. We would do this by watching a video of a yoga instructor on YouTube as our model and read through a task analysis for each pose. We would then record our data on the task analysis for each pose during each session. And then once the baseline stabilized, we would introduce our intervention of video self-evaluation, which means we would watch the videos of ourselves, analyze the poses and any mistakes we made to increase the accuracy for the next sessions. We would then continue to take data and record for the rest of our sessions using the task analysis. The participants in this study are 5 students from Ball State University. One is myself, Autumn Andrus, I'm 25, Michelle Brooks, age 30, Cassie Angelo, age 23, Kirsty Ramirez, age 29, and Zachary Ryder, age 25.
All right, next I'm going to talk about the setting. So in this study, all the participants are from different parts of the United States. Each of the participants conducted all their yoga sessions in their home. The 3 yoga poses that we conducted were Warrior Pose 2, Downward Facing Dog, and Tree Pose, and these were conducted 2 to 3 times per session. There was 1 to 3 sessions conducted per meeting, and then there was also 1 to 3 meetings per week. All participants had interest in yoga, and this was to understand the basics of each pose and to increase our own personal stamina. Next, we'll talk about materials. For this purpose, for recording purposes, all participants used either their own personal computer with a webcam or their own personal cell phone with the camera that's part of the phone. In order to watch each other's videos and the model videos that we watched, the participants needed a computer, and all of the participants used their own personal computers in order to do so. During the actual yoga that all of us conducted, we all used some sort of a yoga mat. Next, we're going to talk about the different poses. So the behaviors consisted of 3 different poses. The first pose that is listed is Virabhadrasana, which is Warrior Pose 2, then Svanasana, which is Downward Facing Dog, and Vrksasana, which is Tree Pose. First, we're going to talk about Warrior Pose 2. So this pose starts with having your feet 2 to 3 inches apart in the front of the mat. Then you would spread your feet out 2 to 3 inches apart, creating a 90-degree angle with your feet. Your back foot would have to go behind your hips in doing so. Then you would bend your front knee to be in line with your front foot, consisting with keeping your back straight and then opening your arms up with arms parallel to the floor and palms facing down. During all of these steps, breathing consistently is extremely important. Next, we're going to talk about Svanasana, which is Downward Facing Dog. You start in a sitting position with you sitting on your calves, and then as you do so, you will keep your back straight. Then the legs are straight with the heels reaching the floor. Then you tuck your feet, lifting your pelvis to the sky, and that is very crucial. Then making sure your legs do not lock when you get into that inverted V shape shown in the picture. As you are doing so, you need to breathe consistently throughout each step, which is also very important, same as Warrior Pose 2. And then last but not least, we will talk about Vrksasana, which is Tree Pose. Again, same as Warrior Pose 2, stand on the mat with your feet 2 to 3 inches apart, grab your ankle, then hold it, and bring your knee up to the navel area, which is your belly button area. And in doing so, release your leg as it touches the inside of your thigh while balancing on one foot, either your right or your left foot. Then as that is occurring, grip your hands to your hips and then release them to your side. After doing that, you will then raise them to the ceiling, keeping your palms facing parallel to each other. And again, which is very important, same in downward dog and warrior pose 2, breathing is extremely crucial.
Data was collected by using a video camera to record each of the participants' sessions performing the yoga poses and scoring each pose using the task analyses, which were shown in previous slides. In order for the pose to be counted as correct, each participant must have held the Warrior 2 pose and the tree pose for 30 seconds and the downward facing dog pose for 1 minute. The behaviors shown in the task analyses for each pose were scored as correct by marking a plus sign or incorrect by marking a minus sign during each assessment session. The following formula was used to calculate the percentage of poses that were performed correct. Correct steps divided by the total steps times 100 to get the percentage. The design of our study was a single subject design. Data from interventions was analyzed through a multiple baseline across behaviors design, which was used to determine the outcomes of video self-evaluation on 3 yoga poses: the Warrior 2 pose, the downward facing dog pose, and the tree pose. 2 sessions of baseline were conducted with video models to demonstrate the 3 yoga poses. The video model that we chose to use was Yoga with Adrian, which was found on YouTube. Below is where you can find each video from the video model that we used. Each participant watched the same video model for accuracy. It took approximately 10 minutes per baseline session. No feedback was provided to the participants during baseline.
Okay, so next we're going to talk about the treatment phases. Treatment began once every participant stabilized during their baseline phase. The researcher collected data using the task analysis and notified the participant when their results were stable and they could begin treatment. Treatment consisted of a video self-evaluation in which the participants recorded each individual session and watched the session immediately after each pose. While they watched, they scored themselves using a task analysis for each pose. During treatment phase, the researcher and participant watched the videos together and scored the task analysis together. Each session after this was scored independently by the participant using the task analysis. During this, no feedback was given from the researcher. During the treatment phase, the researcher scored the participant using a task analysis and compared this to the participant's individual scoring of the task analysis to determine treatment integrity. If integrity fell below 80% agreement, the video feedback procedure was implemented. In this case, the participant would watch the video model again in order to improve skill acquisition. No participant in the group required video retraining. For IOA, in order to determine inter-observer agreement, a total of 33% of each participant's videos were viewed and evaluated by 2 other participants in the group. In order to reach agreement, both participants must score correct or incorrect for the same step of the task analysis for each pose. Inter-observer agreement was then calculated for each task analysis by dividing the number of agreements by the number of total steps in the task analysis and multiplying the result by 100. So if you look at our chart here for the first participant, which was me, the warrior pose was 81% for IOA, downward dog was 56%, and the tree pose was 67%, and then my overall IOA percentage was 68%. For Cassie, the warrior pose was 72.9%, downward dog was 69.1%, and tree pose was 90%, and her overall IOA percentage was 77.3%. For Autumn, it was 80.4% for warrior pose. Downward dog was 90%, I'm sorry, I lost track, 90%, and then tree pose was 93.1%. And the overall IOA percentage for her was 88.1%. And then for Michelle, it was 63% for warrior pose, 84% for downward facing dog, 83% for tree pose, and her overall percentage was 76.6%. And for Zach, his warrior pose was 93%, downward facing dog 88%, tree pose 97%, and his overall percentage was 92.6%. And then next we have treatment integrity. Integrity was monitored and determined by calculating the percentage of agreement between the researcher and the participant on each step for each task analysis. The number of agreements in the task analysis was divided by the total number of steps in the task analysis, and the resulting number was converted into a percentage to determine treatment integrity. During treatment phase, if integrity fell below 80% agreement, the researcher would retrain the participant on how to use the task analysis while the participant watches the video. No participants in our group needed retraining, as integrity did not fall below 80% for any of the sessions. So if you look at our graph here for treatment integrity, for me, my researcher was Cassie, and my integrity percent average was 94%. And for Cassie, her researcher was me, and her integrity percentage was 93.7%. And for Michelle, her researcher was Autumn, and her integrity average was 87%. And for Autumn, her researcher was Zach, and her percentage was 89.4%. And for Zach, his researcher was Michelle, and his average was 94.9%. Now we're going to go over our results. So for my results, if you look at my first pose for downward facing dog, my baseline range was 40% to 60%, and my average was 48% during baseline. And for the intervention phase, my range was 50% to 100%, and my average was 66%. What I found most hard for me about this pose was holding it for 1 minute. So that affected my percentage during the intervention phase. And for warrior pose, my baseline range was 50% to 75%, and my average was 68%. In the intervention phase, my range was 63 to 100%, and my average was 80%. And for my tree pose, my baseline range was 63% to 88%, and average was 74%. And for my intervention phase for tree pose, my range was 75 to 100%, and my average was 92%.
Hi, I'm Cassie, and I'm going to discuss my results. I have had no prior experience in yoga, but after learning the poses, it was pretty easy to get the hang of each pose. For the tree pose, my baseline range was from 63% to 75%, and my baseline average was 67.8%. My intervention range was 75% to 100%, and my intervention average was 86.5%. For the downward facing dog pose, my baseline range was 50% to 80%, and my baseline average was 64.4%. My intervention range was 70% to 90%, and my intervention average was 78.1%. For the Warrior 2 pose, my baseline range was 63% to 88%, and my baseline average was 79.1%. My intervention range was 63% to 100%, and my intervention average was 83.3%. To the left is a copy of my graph, which shows a multiple baseline across behaviors design, representing the percentage accuracy of the task analysis. The top graph shows the tree pose, the middle graph shows the downward facing dog pose, and the last graph shows the Warrior 2 pose. As you can see from my baseline, it was pretty easy to learn the 3 poses due to the fact that they were basic yoga poses. But during my intervention phase, I found that watching myself perform the poses did not help me as much as seeing the data from myself and my researcher on the task analyses to see which steps I needed improvement on the most.
Now we're going to go over my results, and to the left you'll see the graph for all of the 3 poses that I performed. The first top graph is the data for the warrior pose. As you can see in the baseline, I had 9 sessions with an average of 78% and a range of 63 to 88%. And then in the video self-evaluation phase, an overall average of 98% with a range of 75 to 100%. The center graph is the data for the downward dog pose, and in the baseline, an average of 85% with a range of 80 to 90%. And then in the video self-evaluation phase, there was an overall average of 97% with a range of 90 to 100. And then the last graph on the bottom is the data for the tree pose. And there was an overall average in baseline of 73% with a range of 63 to 75%. And then in the treatment phase, an overall average of 94% with a range of 75 to 100%. Overall, I found that my results were similar to the original study in that the longer baselines showed more improvement. For example, the top graph, I had 9 treatment phases in baseline, and that was that was showed 88% overall. Was more common to get 88% in my baseline for that one. And then overall in the video self-evaluation form, like the original study, I also noticed improvement right away. There is one section on my downward facing dog around sessions 23 that I had like an injury to my knee, and so I wasn't able to perform one step, and that's the only reason why it went from 100% to 90%. So I did think that the video self-evaluation was effective, just because I was able to continuously, once I hit 100, I was able to continuously achieve that each consecutive session. So it would be interesting to, if we did have a maintenance phase, which this replication study did not, to see if I would be able to maintain those results. But so next we're going to discuss the other participants' results. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Autumn, and I will discuss my results. I did have limited experience in yoga before this project, but as you can see from my data, the video self-evaluation was an effective way to increase my accuracy at my yoga postures. However, I did feel like just simply redoing the postures over and over was increasing the accuracy rather than the video self-evaluation. So my first graph is Warrior 2 pose. My baseline range is 37.5 to 75%, and the average is 66.5%. For the intervention, my range was 87.5 to 100%, with the average 98.3%. My second graph is the tree pose. The baseline range is 50% to 75%, and the average is 58%. The intervention range is 62.5% to 100%, and the average is 95.5%. My third graph is the downward dog pose. The baseline range is 30% to 60%. The average is 41%. And for the intervention, the range is 80% to 100%, with the average being 97%.
Next, I'm going to talk about my data and my results. I felt after doing all 36 sessions that self-evaluation, video self-evaluation, watching myself yoga poses really helped me kind of increase accuracy. So looking at my graph on the left side, starting with Warrior Pose 2, My baseline range was 37.5% to 62.5%, averaging out to 47.22%. Then the intervention part, which is video self-evaluation, my range was 75% to 100%, averaging out to 93.9%. The next graph shown is downward facing dog. Baseline range was 70 to 80%, and my average was 72.72%. Going to video self-evaluation, the intervention phase, the range was 80% to 100%, and my average was 93.75%. The last pose that we worked on was tree pose. The baseline was 50 to 75%, and the average was 66.67% for baseline. And intervention, again, which was video self-evaluation, my range was 87.5% to 100%, and the average was 91.82%. So overall, I felt that the video self-evaluation definitely did help. As you can see, my baselines were low for certain poses where like downward facing dog was much easier for me to work on. But as I was going along and doing them multiple times, I feel that fatigue definitely did enter near the end, causing my results to fluctuate. Next, we're going to talk about the conclusions. So overall, after all 5 of us worked on this study and did all 36 sessions, we felt that self-evaluation was a successful and inexpensive way to evaluate and conduct these task analysis that we came up with. And this was for both baseline and skill acquisition. And then for this specific project, all the participants, all 5 of us, came to a conclusion after self-evaluating each oneself and others in the group that this type of intervention is perfect for this type of skill and learning and engaging in different yoga poses. And it can be used across yoga. As shown, all participants did not have to retrain as treatment integrity was above 80%. For all the participants throughout the study, the accuracy of the yoga poses did increase session by session, fluctuating a little bit depending on fatigue and stamina, which we were trying to increase. This determined that self-evaluation can be a successful tool for this skill. And overall, functional relation was shown as the data for all participants increased the accuracy going from baseline to intervention. So next, we're going to talk about limitations.
We have found quite a few limitations while replicating this study. The first limitation was with the model. Participants did not have access to a live yoga trainer, where video models had to be used instead. The next limitation was with the setting. Participants did not have access to a yoga studio and had to record in the confines of their home, which space was limited for movement. Another limitation we found was with the participants. Some of the participants had prior experience in yoga, which could allow for higher percentages during baseline and the intervention phase. Next, there were limitations with the task analyses. Due to the fact that we had to use a video model to demonstrate the yoga poses, some elements of the task analysis did not align with the video model. Another limitation was with treatment integrity. Every group member was a participant, and every participant were assigned to a group member, creating a pair. It was discovered that whenever questions related to the task analysis arose, participants would reach out to their researchers for opinion on interpretation. It is possible that this created a high rate of integrity agreement, resulting in all participants reaching above 80% and the lack of need for retraining. There were also limitations with IOA data. IOA data was affected by the interpretation of the task analysis for each pose. It is possible that each group member interpreted the steps of the task analysis differently, resulting in a lower IOA percentage. The final limitation that we found was with maintenance. There was not enough time for the participants to run the maintenance phase due to time constraint.
Thank you for listening to our review. And that's all that we have for you today. Thank you.